He stood over me while I bled on the floor, laughed, and told me I couldn't even protect myself. He locked me inside a mansion for 2 months, cut off every phone line, chained the gates, and systematically tried to destroy my mind. Every single day. And I let him. I let him think it was working. I let him believe that every flinch, every sob, every trembling lip meant he was winning. Because here's what Marcus never understood, and what ultimately destroyed him completely. The most dangerous person in any room is not the one screaming the loudest. It's the one sitting quietly in the corner taking notes. My name is Eleanor. I'm 53 years old, and this is the story of how I dismantled my stepbrother's entire existence, using nothing but patience, a device he thought was a fitness tracker, and 20 years of experience putting monsters exactly like him behind bars. Before we get into it, if you're new here, welcome. If this kind of story is your thing, real, raw, and absolutely satisfying, hit that subscribe button right now, because we post stories like this every single week. And if you think someone in your life needs to hear this one, share it with them. It might mean more than you know. All right, let's go back to the beginning. My father, Richard Vance, built his empire the hard way. He started with one small commercial property in his late 20s, a rundown strip mall in a forgettable suburb, and spent the next 3 decades turning it into a $50 million portfolio of commercial real estate, liquid assets, and corporate holdings. He was methodical, patient. He never made a decision without sleeping on it 3 times. He always said that the people who moved fast were the people who ended up losing everything. I inherited that quality from him. My stepbrother Marcus, who entered our lives when his mother married my father 17 years ago, inherited nothing resembling it. Marcus was loud where my father was quiet, impulsive where my father was deliberate, charming in the surface level, backslapping way that fools people at cocktail parties but doesn't survive sustained scrutiny. He had spent the last decade attaching himself to my father's business like a barnacle, attending board meetings, handling overseas accounts, inserting himself so completely into the day-to-day operations that, by the time my father's health started declining, Marcus had successfully convinced a lot of people that he was the one actually running things. He had also apparently convinced himself. I need to tell you something about myself before I continue, because it matters enormously to everything that comes after. I am the Honorable Eleanor Vance, Senior Judge of the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. I have been sitting on the federal bench for 20 years. Before my sabbatical, which I had taken to spend time with my father during his illness, I had presided over cases involving cartel bosses, human traffickers, multi-billion-dollar corporate fraud schemes, and organized crime networks that stretched across 4 continents. I have looked dangerous men in the eye every single day for 2 decades and watched them try to perform confidence while I quietly calculated exactly how long they were going to prison. I am not, by any conceivable definition of the word, a fragile woman. But Marcus didn't know that. Or more accurately, Marcus had decided long ago that because I was quiet, bookish, and had spent my career behind a bench rather than behind a boardroom desk, I was somehow weak, soft, manageable. He had 17 years of dinners and holidays and family, gatherings to form an opinion of me, and the opinion he had formed was catastrophically, fatally wrong. I flew in from my father's funeral on a gray Thursday morning in October. The estate was silent in the way that large, expensive houses go silent when the person who gave them life is gone. All that square footage suddenly, feeling less like a home and more like a museum exhibit. I had barely set my bag down in the guest room before the estate attorney, a careful, soft-spoken man named Gerald, pulled me aside and told me quietly that the will reading was scheduled for that afternoon. I already knew what the will said. My father had discussed it with me privately 6 weeks before he died. He had been worried, he told me, about what would happen to the money if Marcus got hold of it. He loved Marcus in the complicated, exhausted way that step-parents sometimes love difficult stepchildren, with genuine care and genuine frustration, living side by side. But he did not trust him with $50 million. He had watched Marcus's financial decisions for years. He had watched the impulse buys, the bad investments, the casual cruelty toward people he considered beneath him. He had made his decision. Everything to Eleanor, nothing to Marcus. Gerald read the will at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the formal study, a wood-paneled room that smelled of old leather and lemon, polish and the ghost of my father's pipe tobacco. Marcus sat across from me in a wing-back chair, his legs crossed, his expression practiced and neutral, in the way of a man who has already decided how he's going to react to good news. Gerald read the relevant clauses. The room went very quiet, and then Marcus's face changed. I have seen a lot of faces change in courtrooms over the years. I have seen the exact moment when a defendant realizes the jury has convicted them, when a witness realizes their alibi has collapsed, when a lawyer realizes their entire case has just been destroyed by a single document. I have a clinical, practiced ability to read the precise topography of a human face losing control. What happened to Marcus's face in that moment was not grief. It was not shock. It was not even simple anger. It was the specific volcanic white-hot fury of a man who believes the world owes him something and has just been told, unambiguously, that it doesn't. Gerald finished reading. He packed his briefcase. He left the room with the quiet efficiency of a man who had delivered difficult news before and knew that the best thing to do immediately afterward was to not be present. The door clicked shut behind him. Marcus looked at me across the study. "Sign the transfer, Eleanor," he said. His voice had dropped into a register I'd never heard from him before. Low, controlled, and genuinely threatening. He pulled a folded document from the inside pocket of his blazer, a hastily drafted asset transfer, already prepared. He had known. He had suspected what the will might say, and he had prepared for it. "Sign everything over to me right now, and we can pretend this afternoon never happened." I looked at the document. I looked at him. I kept my face carefully, deliberately neutral. Not defiant. Not frightened, just blank. I was already calculating. Already thinking 3 moves ahead. "I need time to review it with my own attorney," I said quietly. That was the wrong answer. What happened next happened fast. Marcus came out of his chair, crossed the room in 4 strides, grabbed the collar of my silk blouse, hauled me halfway to my feet, and delivered an open-handed backhand across my face that sent me crashing into the mahogany coffee table. My shoulder hit the edge of it hard. My head hit the Persian rug. A high, sharp ringing erupted in my left ear, and I tasted blood, hot, metallic, immediate, pooling in the corner of my mouth. I lay on the floor and I did something that I want you to understand required. Every single ounce of professional discipline I had accumulated over 20 years on the bench. I cowered. I curled into myself, raised my arms to cover my face, and produced a soft, convincing whimper. I made myself small. I made myself look exactly like what Marcus needed me to be in that moment. Broken, frightened, and infinitely manageable. "Look at you," Marcus said, breathing hard, looking down at me with an expression of pure contemptuous satisfaction. "You can't even protect yourself. You have until tomorrow to sign those papers, or the bruises will be the least of your problems." He turned around, walked out of the study, and locked the door from the outside. I stayed on the floor until his footsteps faded completely down the long hallway. Until the house was silent. Until I was absolutely certain I was alone. Then I sat up. The trembling in my hands, which had been entirely real, because I am a human. Being and having someone hit you is genuinely unpleasant regardless of your professional experience. Stopped almost immediately. I wiped the blood from my lip and examined it with the detached, clinical curiosity of someone assessing evidence rather than experiencing injury. On my left wrist, beneath my sleeve, the device I'd been wearing since the moment I'd booked my flight 3 weeks ago, pulsed with a faint green light. It was not a Fitbit. It was a military-grade encrypted recording and transmission device, custom-built by a forensic security firm I had worked with on several federal cases. I had contacted them the day after my father called me, 6 weeks before he died, and told me he was worried about what Marcus might do when the will was read. My father had been worried. I had been prepared. I tapped the face of the watch twice and spoke quietly into the microscopic microphone embedded in the bezel. Timestamp, October 14th, 6:42 p.m. Subject Marcus. Vance has committed assault and battery and has articulated a clear threat of escalating violence in the commission of felony extortion. The bait has been taken. I lowered my wrist and sat in the dark room for a long moment. The physical pain in my jaw was temporary. The trap I was building was going to be permanent. What followed was 2 of the most deliberately, carefully endured months of my life. Marcus moved fast, once he understood I wasn't going to sign willingly. Within 48 hours, he had the Wi-Fi severed at the junction box. He confiscated my cell phone. I gave it up without a fight, which visibly surprised him and then visibly pleased him, which told me everything I needed to know about how he'd interpreted my compliance. He had the landlines disconnected. He paid the estate staff, the housekeeper, the groundskeeper, the 2 kitchen employees, exorbitant severance packages and sent them home with the kind of enthusiastic generosity that comes with an implied understanding that their silence had been purchased, along with their departure. He chained the wrought iron gates at the end of the 2-mile driveway. To the outside world, the Vance family estate was simply observing a private period of mourning. A grieving family withdrawing from the world to process their loss. Completely understandable. Extremely normal. Inside the walls, Marcus had constructed a very specific kind of prison. He regulated when I could leave the guest bedroom. He controlled my meals, sometimes bringing them, sometimes not, with no apparent schedule or logic, which I recognized as a deliberate destabilization tactic. He subjected me to unpredictable hours-long sessions of psychological assault, cycling between threats, manipulation, nostalgic reminiscing about our childhood that was clearly designed to manufacture emotional dependency and cold, calculated cruelty. He was running a textbook isolation and demoralization program, and he was running it with a methodical commitment that would have been almost impressive if it wasn't so transparently the behavior of a man who had done this before. I want to be honest with you about something. It was hard. I am a federal judge. I have presided over some of the most difficult criminal proceedings in this country's recent history. I have a professional, cultivated capacity for emotional detachment that most people spend careers developing, and 2 months of physical confinement, irregular meals, and daily psychological warfare still wore on me in ways I hadn't entirely anticipated. There were nights when I lay in the guest bedroom listening to the silence of the locked house and felt the specific, heavy weight of genuine isolation pressing down on my chest. But here is what Marcus never understood, could not have understood, because he had constructed his entire understanding of power around noise and force and visible dominance. Stillness is not weakness. Endurance is not surrender. And a federal judge is never, ever, more dangerous than when she is sitting perfectly quietly, listening to a hostile witness talk himself directly into a life sentence. That is exactly what I was doing, every single day. Through every meal he withheld, every threat he made, every calculated humiliation, he designed specifically to make me feel small and frightened and alone. I was listening. I was cataloging. I was building a case with the patient, meticulous precision of someone who has spent 20 years making them airtight. The watch on my wrist was recording everything. My court-trained memory was cataloging every timestamp, every specific threat, every incriminating admission. Marcus thought he was destroying my mind. He was actually building his prosecution. The moment I had been most carefully waiting for came on a rainy Tuesday evening. About 6 weeks in, Marcus was drunk, which by that point in the 2 months was his near-permanent state, pacing the length of the dining room, while I sat at the long table pushing cold food around my plate. The dark purple bruise along my jawline from 3 days earlier had started fading to an ugly, mottled yellow. I kept my eyes down. I kept my posture small. I kept my voice at the pathetic, trembling register that Marcus had come to expect and, more importantly, to trust. He was in the middle of one of his monologues, the kind where the bourbon and the ego and the unresolved fury about The will combined into this rambling, revealing stream of consciousness that he genuinely seemed to believe was proof of his superiority rather than evidence of his guilt. He was talking about the board meetings he'd run while my father was sick, the offshore accounts he'd managed, the work he'd done that he felt had never been properly acknowledged or rewarded. And then something shifted in his voice. The arrogance was still there, but it was bleeding into something else. Something that wanted to be recognized not just as competent, but as audacious, as untouchable, as the kind of man who does things that lesser people can't comprehend and gets away with them. I recognized the shift. I've seen it in courtrooms. It's the moment when a narcissist stops wanting to threaten you and starts wanting to impress you. It was time to guide the witness. He died of a massive heart attack, Marcus, I whispered, my voice thick with the carefully calibrated performance of grief. I was offering him a clean narrative, a simple official story. The doctors said it was sudden. It was just a tragedy. Marcus stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still at the head of the table. A smile spread across his face, slow, dark, spreading like an oil slick, and he picked up his bourbon glass and looked at me with eyes that I can only describe as entirely, chillingly empty of anything resembling a human soul. A heart attack, he said softly, almost to himself. He shook his head. That's what the coroner's report says. That's what the obituary says. You're incredibly naive, Eleanor. You live in this little black and white world of laws and rules, and you have absolutely no idea how the real world works. He didn't say anything else. He just smiled at his glass and walked out of the room. But what he'd said, that small, loaded, deeply self-incriminating fragment, landed in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. I reached under the table and tapped my watch. He hadn't confessed, not yet. He was standing at the edge of it, looking down. But I had just greased the ledge. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck 2 a.m. I was in the armchair in the corner of the study, wrapped in a thin blanket, my eyes mostly closed. I was not asleep. I had not been truly asleep in weeks, not the deep, unguarded sleep of someone who feels safe, but I had become very good at performing sleep for Marcus's benefit, because a woman who appears to be barely holding herself together is a much more satisfying target for what he had planned than one who appears watchful and alert. I knew he was coming. He had been drinking since noon. Tomorrow was the deadline. He had set, the notary was arriving, at 9 a.m. to witness the coerced asset transfer. Tonight was his last opportunity to ensure that I was so completely, irreparably shattered that I would sign without a word of resistance. The door burst open and slammed against the wall. Marcus came into the room like a storm system, shirt untucked, eyes wild, carrying the unsigned asset transfer documents, in one hand and a half-empty bottle of scotch in the other. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, grabbed a handful of my hair, and dragged me out of the armchair. The pain was genuine. My knees hit the hardwood floor hard enough to leave bruises that I would still be able to document 3 days later. I cried out. I pressed myself back against the bookshelf. I made myself as small as physically possible and produced the specific variety of terrified pleading that Marcus had been conditioning himself to expect for 2 months. No more games, he roared, throwing the documents onto the floor in front of my face. You sign these tomorrow morning or you do not leave this house alive. I have dug a hole on this property before. I will do it again. I gasped. I covered my face. I made my whole body shake. And then he did it. Marcus knelt down directly in front of me and grabbed my jaw, rough, bruising, inescapable, and forced my face up to look at him. His breath was whiskey and malice. His eyes were completely unguarded, stripped by 2 months of drinking uncertainty and the particular madness of someone who is convinced themselves they are invincible. You want to know the truth? He hissed. You want to know what really happened to your precious father? I let a sob tear out of my throat. I let tears pour down my face. What did you do? I choked out. His heart medication, Marcus said, and his voice steadied. It actually steadied, the drunk, raging bluster dropping away, replaced by something quieter and far more frightening. The voice of someone recounting something they were proud of. Digoxin regulates the heartbeat. Highly toxic in heavy doses. He trusted me to pick up his prescriptions. He trusted me to organize his pillboxes every morning. The room had gone completely silent except for his voice and the rain against the windows. I swapped his pills, Marcus said. For 3 weeks, I doubled his dosage. I crushed the extra pills into his morning tea. I watched his health get worse. I watched him complain about his chest. I watched him get weaker every single day. And on the last night, he paused. His expression in that moment is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not because it haunts me, but because it represents the most complete portrait of pure moral vacancy I have ever seen on a human face, and I have seen a great many. He clutched his chest, Marcus continued. He reached his hand out to me. He begged me to call an ambulance. He begged me to save his life. And I stood there. I poured myself a drink, and I watched him die. He left me nothing, Eleanor, so I took his life, and tomorrow morning, I'm taking his money. I buried my face in my hands and wailed, behind my palms in the dark enclosure of my own hands. Pressed against my face, my eyes were completely dry. I lowered my left hand to my thigh. I tapped the face of the watch twice. The device registered the acoustic confirmation signal. The green light flashed 3 times, and then a faint vibration against my skin. Almost imperceptible. The kind you might mistake for a heartbeat, confirmed what I had been working toward for 2 months. The audio file, crystal clear, high definition, legally unimpeachable, had just bypassed the estate's jammed Wi-Fi network through a hidden cellular uplink and uploaded directly to the secure, isolated servers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marcus stood up, kicked the documents toward my knees, told me to be ready at 9, and stumbled out of the study. I listened to his footsteps go up the main staircase. I listened to his bedroom door slam. Then I stopped crying. I stood up. I straightened my clothing, rolled my shoulders back, and felt my spine align itself into the posture I had spent 20 years inhabiting, the posture of someone who has absolute, total unshakable command of the room they are standing in. I had endured the fire. Now it was time to burn his world to the ground. The morning light came through the velvet drapes, gray and cold. At exactly 9 a.m., Marcus walked into the study. He looked terrible. Hungover, unshaven, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose skull is housing a significant amount of pain, but he was smug. The smugness was the one thing that had survived the night intact. He was accompanied by a lawyer I didn't recognize, a thin man in a cheap suit who had the specific, practiced inability to make eye contact that I associate with people who have accepted money to do something they know is wrong. The lawyer opened his briefcase without a word. He laid the asset transfer documents on the desk. He produced a pen and held it out toward me. I was sitting in my father's chair behind the desk. I looked at the documents. I looked at the $50 million sitting on that mahogany surface in the form of signatures and legal language. I looked at the pen. Then I placed both hands flat on the desk, stood up slowly, and buttoned my blazer. I don't think I will, I said. I want to try to explain what those 5 words sounded like in that room, because it matters. For 2 months, my voice had been a trembling whisper, pathetic, small, the voice of a woman barely keeping herself together. That was the voice Marcus had been conditioned to expect. That was the voice that matched the picture of me he had been constructing and reinforcing for 63 days. What came out of my mouth at 9 o'clock on the morning of December 16th was the voice I use in courtrooms. It is not loud. It doesn't need to be. It is the voice of someone who has spent 20 years being the final, absolute, unappealable authority in every room she occupies. It resonated off the walls of that study like a tuning fork striking crystal. Marcus froze. His smugness flickered. His brain, still fighting through last night's scotch, struggled to reconcile what it was hearing with the woman it thought it knew. "What did you just say to me?" he growled, taking a step forward. I reached down and unclasped the Fitbit from my wrist. I held it up for a moment and let the green light catch the gray, morning coming through the windows, and then set it down on the center of the mahogany desk. It landed with a sound like a gavel. "You thought you were terrorizing a helpless woman," I said. "You thought my silence meant you were breaking me. You forgot that before my sabbatical, I spent 20 years on the federal bench." The lawyer had gone absolutely still. His eyes were fixed on the watch with the expression of a man watching a grenade. "I am Senior Judge Eleanor Vance of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals," I continued, and I watched Marcus's face as each word landed. "And that device is not a fitness tracker. It is a secure military-grade transmitter. At 2:14 this morning, it uploaded your complete, uncoerced, explicit confession to the premeditated murder of our father directly, to the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The color left Marcus's face, not gradually, all at once like a drain opening. He went the gray-white color of wet concrete, and for the first time in 2 months, I watched the absolute certainty drain out of his eyes and get replaced by something that I recognized from 20 years of watching defendants understand their verdicts. Pure, unmitigated terror. "You're lying." He lunged for the desk, lunged for the watch, as if crushing a piece of hardware could undo what had already been transmitted and received and logged, his hand scrabbling across the mahogany. He never reached it. The windows of the study did not break. They exploded. The glass came inward in a single, simultaneous sheet, both front windows, blown in by the weight of the tactical entry team coming through them. Flashbang grenades detonated in the foyer, 2 of them, in rapid sequence, with a concussive crack that shook the walls. The front doors blew open. "FBI, nobody move, hands!" 12 tactical agents in full black kit poured through every entry point. Simultaneously, red laser sights cut through the dust. 2 of them hit Marcus from different angles before he could finish turning around. Took him straight to the hardwood, 200 pounds of federal agent driving a knee into his spine on each side. The handcuffs went on with a sound I have always found deeply satisfying. The lawyer was already on the floor, hands over his head, producing a sustained, undignified noise that I will simply describe as not his best moment. "Judge Vance." The lead tactical agent moved to my position, his rifle still up. "Are you secure?" "I am secure, Agent," I said. They dragged Marcus to his feet. His nose was bleeding from where it had met the floor. He was hyperventilating, eyes wide, looking at me with a combination of horror and disbelief that I can only describe as the specific expression of a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. As they pulled him toward the door, he looked back at me. I looked at him, at this man who had beaten me, starved me, isolated me, and murdered my father, with complete and total composure. "Court is adjourned, Marcus," I said. The trial was not a trial so much as it was a formality. When you walk into a courtroom with a crystal clear, high-definition audio recording of the defendant explaining in precise, enthusiastic detail exactly how he poisoned his stepfather and watched him die, the defense doesn't really have anywhere to go. His attorneys were expensive and they were good, and they tried several angles, but there is no angle from which a man's own voice, in his own words describing his own crime, becomes exculpatory. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Premeditated murder. 6 months after Marcus was remanded into federal custody, I sat in my chambers in my judicial robes with my platinum fountain pen and signed my name to a document that had taken 4 months of legal work to prepare. The 50 million Vance Sanctuary for the Abused, a nationwide network of high-security shelters, legal defense funds, and psychological support centers for victims of domestic violence. Funded by the entirety of my father's estate, the $50 million that Marcus had killed to steal, repurposed into a structure that would protect people from men exactly like him for generations. I didn't need the money. My career had given me everything I needed, but I needed to do something with it that would outlast both of us. Something that would take the worst thing my stepbrother had ever done and turn it into its own opposite. I like to think my father would have approved. There were difficult things in the months after the Arrests that I want to be honest about, because this isn't a story about someone who felt nothing. The official investigation into my father's death required an exhumation and a toxicological reanalysis of his remains, and that process was one of the hardest things I have ever been present for. Sitting in a medical examiner's office while the clinical language of cause of death. Reports confirmed what I already knew, that he had been deliberately, methodically poisoned by someone he loved and trusted, was a kind of grief that I don't have adequate language for. I also spent 3 months working with a therapist who specializes in complex trauma, because 63 days of physical abuse and psychological warfare leaves marks that don't always show up in the places you expect. I am a federal judge. I am not immune to human pain, but here is where I ended up. 1 year after the arrest, I was sitting on the bench in a packed federal courtroom presiding over a massive corporate fraud case, and beneath the desk, in my left hand, I was holding the envelope from Marcus's defense attorney, the plea bargain offer I had never opened, which I had kept for an entire year as a kind of personal barometer. I held it and I waited, the way I had learned to wait during those 2 months in the estate, for whatever I was going to feel. I felt nothing. Not anger, not grief, not satisfaction, not pity, nothing. Marcus Vance was a closed file, a settled case. He existed in a 6x8 concrete cell in a maximum security federal penitentiary, and that fact had absolutely zero connection to the life I was living and the work I was doing and the woman I was. I dropped the envelope in the trash without opening it. I picked up my gavel. Here's what I want to leave you with. Marcus made a lot of mistakes. He underestimated my professional background. He talked too much. He trusted his own invincibility so completely that he confessed to murder to a woman he was in the process of attempting to rob. But his most fundamental, most catastrophic mistake was one that I see made constantly, in courtrooms, in families, in offices, in relationships everywhere. He assumed that a woman's silence was a surrender. He looked at someone who was choosing not to fight, back on his terms, and he interpreted that restraint as weakness. He looked at patience and read fear. He looked at stillness and read defeat. He had no framework for understanding that the person sitting quietly across from him, absorbing every blow, never raising her voice, never reacting the way he expected, was not losing. She was winning. She had been winning the whole time. The silence wasn't the sound of someone breaking. It was the quiet, meticulous sound of a trap snapping shut. If this story hit home for you, if you know someone who needs to hear it, share it with them. It might matter more than you realize. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And drop a comment below. I read every single one. I'll see you next time.